read this, and you're going to have to watch me read it. Sorry about that. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We're just a little bit late. So thank you all for coming out. This is the April Successful Gardener class, and we are recording. So please mute your line and put any questions or comments, answer each other's questions and comments in the chat box. I already put 3 links in there and mentioned those. So those are to give you more information about the detail of the class coming up. Right now it still shows April, but by the weekend it'll show May. And then you can also see the entire Successful Gardener calendar for the year. And there's also information there about becoming a gardener if you're interested. I'm the Culp, not UCMG website, even though many of us have the same name. Another one of our little glitches. I'm one of the Union County Extension Master Gardeners, and we host this series the first Thursday of every month, except for December, starting at 7 o'clock. Next month, Ian Schaller will be presenting about fertilizer. The way I found him was through Organic Grower School, and he used to work at the Dr. John Wilson Community Garden in Black Mountain, which, if you are from that area, is allegedly this massive community garden and fairly well known in the area. So he's since moved to Fort Collins, Colorado, but he's going to have to get himself back to, North Carolina ideas here. He's going to talk about fertilizing, when, how much, and how to make your own with things that you may have in your backyard. So that's, or front, or whatever. So that's kind of a different way of looking at things, not just going to the store and buying the stuff. And goodness knows it's not cheap. So that's going to be really interesting to see what he has to say. A very different perspective on things. And you register again online. All of you seem to have figured that one out. Let's see. We have a lot of information on our website. So if you go out there to look for the Successful Gardener information, you will see lots of other things. And if you have any ideas for that, by all means, there's lots of places that you can send us a note. By all means, send us what you would like to see on the website. But let's get to tonight. You can see what it's going to be about: dirty hands and green thumbs. And I can attest to having dirty hands right now. Debbie Dillion is going to talk about direct seeding, which that's the easiest thing in the world, except when you ignore them and they die before they come up. Transplanting and maintenance, the other thing I'm not great at. Debbie is our extension agent liaison for the Master Gardener program and an excellent gardener in her own right. I wrote that she knows her stuff, because she does. I don't think I've ever had a question for her that she wasn't able to answer, or at least find out for me, but usually she's got it off the top of her head. I think if you are like me, you are ready to plant some stuff and maybe even a little overzealous. A friend of mine went to the UNCC plant sale today and spent a lot of money. So now she's got to go home and plant that stuff, right? So Debbie's going to help us to maybe contain ourselves a little bit. And make sure that everything survives, right? Because we spend a lot of money on this stuff, a lot of time anyway, and we want it all to survive. I already mentioned, put your questions in the chat box, and we're recording this. Thank you, Cindy. And so it'll be on YouTube hopefully by the end of next week, and the link will be on the website. So let me get to this so it's nice and big. And Debbie, you just tell me when to push the button.
Advance, okay.
Yeah. You keep going, and I'm gonna see if I can figure out how to make it look better.
Okay, so we're talking mostly vegetables tonight, but I spoke to a garden club earlier today that are growing in galvanized water troughs, and they not only growing vegetables, they're growing annuals and even perennials in them. So if you have questions, please, like Christina said, type them in the chat box and she can feed them to me. So I'll say next, Christina.
Look at me.
So, before you start thinking about a garden, you need to think. There's things you need to consider. There's planning. You need to think about your garden location. Most master gardeners know about testing your soil. And then how are you going to grow it? So next. So things you need to think about. Who's going to do the work? Is it going to be you? Is it going to be your kids, your grandkids, your hubby? A lot of people use their male partner usually to dig holes. It's like, dig the hole here and I'm going to plant this there, you know. What do you and your family like to eat? If you're going to grow vegetables or fruits, you want to grow something you're going to eat. You know, I don't like greens, turnip greens, those types of things, so I don't grow them. How are you going to use it? Are you going to eat it fresh? Are you going to freeze it or can it? Maybe you're going to dehydrate it. Maybe you're going to make something and freeze it. I know not last year, but year before last, I had tomatoes and basil, and I found me an easy recipe for tomato soup. It had tomato, basil, onion, and salt, and that was it. I'm one person, so I made some of that. I put it in Ziploc bags. Each Ziploc bag had 2 servings in it, you know. So it was a great way to use my excess tomatoes. And how much space do you have? You know, these folks up at the Windsor Garden Club that I spoke to earlier today, you know, they're retired folks. This is a retirement community, and they've gone from having yards with big gardens to, you know, gardening in a horse water trough, so to speak, you know, maybe 2.5 feet by 5 or 6 feet long. So they're really, you know, limited in what they can grow. Are you going to grow things that are going to need structural support? One of the things that came up with this group today was they have height limits. I didn't catch what the height limit was, but apparently they can't grow anything probably much taller than 6 feet. Some of these tomatoes that you might grow, if they're the indeterminate types, can grow 10, 15, 20 feet by the end of the season, and they usually need some type of support. How many people are you going to feed? And I didn't put that in here, but you can find charts online from the different universities that tell you you need 2 blueberry plants to feed 4 people. You know, things like that. How much corn do you need to plant to feed a family of 4? How many potatoes or tomatoes? So you can find that information out there, but think about that. And then if you're going to grow flowers, what do you want? Do you want color? Do you want to be able to cut them and bring them in for fresh arrangements? Do you want to attract pollinators? So these are all lots of things you have to consider before you even start. Next. So I call this the P's of growing a garden. You plan on paper, you prepare the soil, plant the seed, pamper the plants, pull the weeds, pick the insect and disease plants. That's cultural or mechanical control when you do that. And then you've got that pride and joy of harvesting your crop and sharing it maybe. I know Ron Cox, who used to work in the Ag Center, he grows a huge garden every year. And his thing is he loves sharing it with the people in his church. He brings me tomatoes. He brings me okra. He just, you know, he's proud that he can do that and share it with people. And, you know, who doesn't like saying, look at this big tomato I grew? You know, people post pictures online so you can see it. So these are all the things that you kind of need to think about and consider, you know. Next. So when it comes to plan it on paper first. It's much easier to erase and move things around on paper than it is to plan it and then have to dig it up and move it. Order your seeds in January or February. I think I started getting seed catalogs before Christmas last year. And I got multiples of the same catalog, Johnny's Seed and a couple of others. It would be basically the same catalog with a different cover. You know, they're trying to entice you to order seeds. But you order them early, especially since COVID has hit. There's been real run on them, and they tend to run out because so many people have gotten into gardening. When you're planting your garden, you want to place anything that's tall or maybe trellised on the north side because you don't want it to shade out other plants that you might have in your garden. Next. If you have the space, if you're gardening in the ground, maybe you have 2 garden areas because crop rotation is very important in reducing insect and disease problems. Now, I told the group up there today, this is their first year gardening in those troughs they're gardening in. And in my experience over the years, when you have a garden the first year, vegetable garden, the insects and the diseases don't really find you. It's that second year when they hit. So if you're gardening in the ground and you have space to have 2 gardens, garden in one area one year and have a cover crop in the other area and rotate back and forth. And then don't plant tomatoes or the solanaceous crops in the same spot, rotate them around. There are online, a lot of these catalogs have online garden planners that you can access for a trial period. I think it's usually about a month, and you can play around with it. And then if you want to stay with that, you have to pay a fee. Not very expensive, but it's a way to get it on, a computer and to plan your garden and plan that rotation. You can, in that cover crop area, you can grow cover crops. And the idea with cover crops is they add organic matter. If you use a legume, the legumes will fix nitrogen. They'll take it from the air and hold it in their roots. And then when you mow that or kill that cover crop off, it releases that nitrogen to your next crop. So things like that are great to do. All right, now Christina, next. So think about where you're going to put your garden. It needs to be fairly level. If it's on a hill or a slope, you want to plant your rows in contour along that slope, not up and down it, because you don't want soil erosion in between your rows. It needs to be well-drained soil. You need 8 to 10 hours of sun. There are a few vegetables that will take a little bit of shade, but most of them really want sun all day long. South-facing slope is going to warm up quicker than a north-facing slope. You don't want to put a garden in a low spot. That has to do with water drains down to low areas, but cold air also drains to low areas. So if, for instance, if you have a garden at the bottom of a slope and we were to get a late frost, you could possibly, in theory, have damage at the bottom, the lower spot, and maybe not at the area that's a little bit higher. I've seen that in larger plantings. You want to make sure you have water close by. You don't want to have to drag hoses or carry buckets. That gets old fast, and then a lot of times people will just kind of abandon their gardens. And you know what it's like here in North Carolina in the summer. It's hot and it's dry. So if you can locate your garden near your home where you have easy access to water and it's easy to get out there. You do not want to plant on septic fields because of the food safety that can be an issue, because those actually, the way a septic field works is it not only is absorbed into the ground, but some of it evaporates. And so especially any leafy type thing that is real close to the soil, you would want to avoid planting in those areas. And then, stay away from buildings far enough that they're not throwing shade onto your garden. Stay away from roads. A lot of pollution comes off of roads or streets. You don't realize it, but little bits of rubber off of tires and, small amounts of fluids from vehicles can float through the air. So keep it away from streets or roads if you can. And then if you're going to grow tomatoes especially, they're real prone to walnut trees. Their roots release a chemical called juglone that a lot of vegetables are sensitive to, and tomatoes is one of the worst, most sensitive. So avoid the planting near walnut trees. Next. So, you can't talk about gardening without talking about testing your soil. So to do that, you need a clean plastic bucket. You need some sort of sampling tool. We actually have some of these soil sampling tools in our office that you can check out and use free of charge. But it doesn't have to be a fancy sampling tube. You can use a shovel or a spade or a trowel. And then we have kits that we distribute to all the county libraries, and you can also pick them up at the extension office. And it consists of a information sheet that tells you how to collect a soil sample. There's a sheet you fill out and mail with your samples. You mail your samples directly to the soil testing lab in Raleigh. And it comes with 2 sample boxes. So for instance, you would want to sample a vegetable garden separate from if you're going to grow blueberries or ornamentals. You do separate samples for the different types of things that you might grow. From April 1 to Thanksgiving, the cost for analyzing your sample is free. From Thanksgiving to March 31st, they charge $4 per sample. So, if you can time it where you're sending it now, you usually get the results back quicker and it's cheaper. And then if you have questions, when you get that, you get an email back with a link that gives you your report. If you have questions about that, you can always call me at the extension office, because I can get into their system and pull your report up and look at it and answer any questions you might have. Next. So now, how are you going to grow? Are you going to grow from seed inside? Are you going to have heat mats? Are you going to have lights? Maybe you're just going to go the easy route and purchase transplants, from the garden center or the box stores that are already grown. Or are you going to direct seed outside? And some of that's dictated by what you might grow. Next. It didn't advance, Christina. Uh-oh. Looks like we lost her. There we go. So, there's lots of choices when you're growing plants from seed. Vegetables and annuals, you can grow perennials, you can grow trees and shrubs. Right now I have a flat sitting outside my back door that's got a perennial in it that needs, not only does it needs a cold period, a warm period, and then a cold period before it will germinate. So I've got it sitting out underneath the edge of my house with a floating row cover on it to protect it. And we'll see if it germinates this spring. It may not germinate until next spring. So, you need to understand what you're growing and if it may need special treatment or how long it's going to take it to germinate. Next. So what is inside a seed? And they just did an event this past week with homeschoolers out at the garden, and I don't think they got to the seed part, so they didn't get to talk about it. But this is a great exercise to do with kids, is to show them, have them dissect a seed, and the great big lima beans work best. But inside a seed is the embryo. That's a baby plant. It has the endosperm, which is stored food. So that stored food gives the first little growth that comes out, the cotyledons, the energy they need to break the soil surface and get up into the light, where then once they produce the true leaves, they start to photosynthesize. And then you've got the seed coat, and that's what protects the seed. It keeps it from germinating until environmental conditions are right, and it keeps water out of it. Next. So germination is simply the process of seed growth and development. With plants, the first little green things that come out are not actually true leaves. They're called cotyledons. They're the seed leaves. They've used that stored fruit. A monocot will have one cotyledon and a dicot will have two. So the first thing that happens when a seed starts to germinate is it sends out a radicle, which is that first little root that comes out of the seed. And in this diagram here, you can see the cotyledons are the ones that are closest to the soil, and then the true leaves come after that. Next. So here's just an example that compares a monocot and a dicot. A monocot's going to have one cotyledon, a dicot's going to have two. Most monocots have parallel leaf veins versus dicots have what are called broadleaf or net type veining usually. The vascular bundles are different between the two, and then the floral parts vary. So that is a good identification tool. When you start using a key, it may say petals in groups of 3, or different pistils or female, sexual parts of the plant in multiples of 4 or 5. So you could have 4, you could have 8, you could have 12. So it's a good identification characteristic if you're trying to figure out what a plant is. Next. So what do you need for germination? Well, you need the right environment. You need moisture, you need temperature, you may need light or dark. So sometimes that means the seed needs to be covered or it doesn't need to be covered. If you're growing things from seed, the package will usually tell you that. And then, of course, you need oxygen. Everything needs oxygen. Next. So the first decision, are you going to sow in containers and transplant, or are you going to sow direct? If you want to grow your own tomatoes or peppers, you have to understand the frost dates and that type of thing. Some things like tomatoes and peppers are best grown, from seed and then transplanted versus beans, cucumbers, corn. Those are ones that you would sow direct. Next. So if you're going to sow seed and grow things from seed, you need to use a soilless starter. You don't want to use garden soil because the soilless starter is going to be sterile. It's not going to have any disease organisms in it. It should be well drained. It should be loose. It's usually a real fine texture. It has low fertility. And why is that? Because that seed has everything in it that it needs to germinate and start to grow. It will need fertilizer after it starts to get leaves. Then you can come in with some fertilization. When you start with your soilless mix, you want to moisten it beforehand. And sometimes they're dry and they're hard to moisten. And if you're not doing a lot, hot water works best at moistening that soil quicker. Again, you don't want to use garden soil. Next. So, start your seeds indoors early, and it depends on what you're growing. Tomatoes and peppers take about 6 weeks to grow from seed to a transplantable size that you can move out into the garden, versus something like impatiens, it may take 12 to 14 weeks. And again, the package will usually tell that. A lot of the garden catalogs that sell seeds have great information in them. Johnny's is one. And there's several others that have really good information about starting seeds. Next. Ones that are best started indoors: broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, lettuce, onion, peppers, tomatoes. And the numbers that are in parentheses, you count back from the weeks before the last frost. And that's when you would start your seeds. So look at tomatoes, 6 to 8 weeks. Peppers take a little bit longer. These are all vegetables. Different annual flowers take different times too. Zinnias, marigolds, if you're going to start those inside, they don't take near as long to germinate as the impatiens do. So next. So you need to know when our last frost date is. Now, this is an estimate. Usually we tell people in this area around tax day, around April the 15th. Last year, we had a killing frost on April the 28th. So it can usually go 2 weeks one way or the other, We've already had a weekend where it got really cold down in the 20s, and most people nobody had warm season vegetables in the ground, but the calls that started coming in across the state were damage to the cool season turf. The tall fescue had already started growing because we'd had some warm weather, and then it damaged all the tips. Now, it didn't kill it, but people thought it was a disease. And if people walked across those lawns while it was still frozen, it left spots of footprints through the grass. And so a lot of times your fungus diseases are spots, and so they thought it was a disease, and it was simply cold damage. So you can see that, and you need to, if you're going to put plants in the ground in the middle of April that are warm season, just be aware that you may have to get out there and cover them up or do something to protect them if a frost or freeze is predicted. Now, there are people that'll push the limits. They want to have that first tomato. They want that, say, I got the first tomato. And so they'll put them in the ground early, and they'll protect them with things like cloches or milk jugs, or they sell these things called wall of water that you fill up with water that insulate them. So there's lots of ways you can extend that growing season and back it up, but it takes effort on your part. Next. So sowing seeds in containers. There's all kinds of containers you can use. You can use peat pots. You can use plastic. You can use clay pots. I put this in parentheses here so I'd remember to talk about clay pots dry out a lot quicker because of the evaporation through the sides, and so will some of these little peat pots. But there's all kinds of plastic. There's these little peat pellets you can get. You can use recycled things like yogurt containers. I had a gentleman send me a picture earlier this week of some broccoli he had started from seed. in yogurt containers, you know, small little containers. And these plants looked like they were about 3.5 inches tall, and they were all falling over. He didn't have enough light on them, and so they were tall, spindly plants. But you know, anything, if it's not too large, if you're reusing things, pots, you should disinfect them, and you can use a water to bleach solution 9:1. Soak it for about 5 minutes, and then rinse it and let it dry, and you're ready to go. The most important factor, and this is one thing I asked the folks today that I spoke to that are gardening those water troughs, is did they make drainage holes in the bottom? You've got to have drainage holes. And so that's very important, that whatever you use, you know, if you're using recycled things like yogurt containers, you're going to have to poke some holes in them so that they drain. Next. So the one on the right is a healthy, stocky seedling. The one on the left is what the gentleman's broccoli plants looked like that were in the yogurt containers. You don't realize that, yeah, you've got it underneath a light or you've got it sitting in a window. It's not enough. Light needs to be about 2 inches above those plants, and you raise it as they grow, and they need 16 hours of light per day. So in the past, when I've grown stuff from seed, I have a setup where I have shop lights hanging from a shelf above, and they can be adjusted as far as height goes. You don't have to buy a special grow light. You can use, with my shop lights, I used a cool bulb and a warm bulb, and that gave the spectrum of light. So that worked really good. You can use, you know, some type of lamp and put it close, but if they're not getting enough light, you're going to see what happens on the left, and then they're not going to be very productive. Next. One disease you need to be aware of if you're growing vegetables from seed is damping off. This is a fungal disease, and it affects the stem, usually right close to the soil level. And it's a fungus disease, and it's caused from plants being too wet, so you're overwatering, or they're not draining well, they're too crowded, or it's too cold. So there's a lot of different reasons you can have this. There are labeled fungicides, but once you see this, it's really too late to treat. So, you know, you want to keep them moist but well drained. You don't want them to be too crowded. So if you're just tossing seeds, as soon as they pop up, you want to thin them. And I think I have a slide in a minute that shows you the proper way to thin plants. Any plants that are affected, you need to toss them out, because this can be spread by water to healthy plants. Next. So, you know, transplanting seed-grown plants, you transplant when you see that first true set of leaves. So in this instance, what's pointing towards you in this picture is the cotyledon, and that person has their finger on the first true leaf. You lift it from beneath, and I've always just used a pencil that you can stick down in that loose soil and kind of pop that up. You try not to do much damage to the roots. You kind of want that little root ball to stay intact when you're transplanting. And you can transplant up to the cotyledon, especially if it's a leggy plant, but not more than that. Tomatoes are the exception, because they will root all along their stems. So tomatoes, you can plant a little bit deeper when you transplant them, but most other things not so. Next. So after you grow these little plants from seedlings, before you move them outside, you're going to have to acclimate them. And I recently bought a Daphne at a garden center, and it was kind of in a greenhouse situation. It was open, kind of air, but they were protected. And when we got that cold, my Daphne really got some damage, because I don't think it had been hardened off. You know, it had been grown in a greenhouse. It had come to the garden center nursery, and it was still kind of in a greenhouse setting. So you have to harden off plants. You can kind of start that process inside by backing up on the water a little bit and let them dry out a little bit. You could put a fan on them that blows the little plants, but keep in mind that's going to dry them out quicker too. But that movement helps stiffen up the stems. When you get ready to move them outside, you don't carry them outside into direct sun. You move them into a shady area and let them be exposed to the wind, the brighter. It's still a much brighter light than they have inside and adjust to the temperature. And you do that for 1 or 2 weeks, and gradually you can move them into the sun. And then they'll be what's called acclimated, and they won't get sunburned or damaged when you actually plant them out. If you've got cold frames, that's a good place to move them. And cold frames are not hard to build. You can use straw and lay an old window or a wooden frame that you put some plastic over to protect them. Keep in mind, though, that will heat up during the day. So you always, even on a cool day, have to vent that somewhat. Otherwise, you'll cook your little plants. Next. So if you're purchasing transplants at a garden center, you won't large transplants are usually not the best choice. So that tomato in a gallon bucket or 2-gallon bucket that has flowers on it and maybe little fruit, yeah, it looks good, but when you transplant it, it may not be very productive for you. So when you're buying transplants, you want to look for short, stocky plants with dark green foliage. Small to medium-sized transplants establish more quickly than the large ones do. And, that's the same in the ornamentals. A smaller shrub or tree will establish much quicker than a larger one. And within 2-3 years, those ornamental plants will be the same size. So you do better with smaller to medium-sized transplants than you do with the larger ones. Next. So look for healthy transplants. Here's an example of tomatoes on the left. The one on the right, short and stocky. That's the one you're going for. The one on the left is a lighter color green. Now it's a little bit hard to see in this slide, but it is a lighter color green. The internodes are kind of stretched, so there's more space between them. So you're going for something like that tomato on the right, not the one on the left. Though if you were to purchase the one on the left, the way to handle that, and I think I've got a slide that shows it in a little while, so I won't jump the gun. The photo on the right is an little annual flower, and that one's not root bound. That's a healthy one. When I would go to plant that, I'd pull on those roots a little bit and kind of tease them out a little bit, and then I'd stick it in the ground. No deeper than what it is, in the soil plug that it's in. Next. So this is a diagram that shows you how you can plant tomatoes deep. They will root all along their stems. So the one on the left shows you there's like 2 or maybe 3 sets of leaves left at the top, and then they put it down in the hole, and the soil will be pulled up to right just below those leaves. You really don't want the leaves to touch the soil, but a lot of that stem is going to be below the soil line and it will root. If you do get some of those tall, leggy tomatoes, the way to plant those is to lay them sideways. Again, you'll take off all but the top 2 or 3 sets of leaves, dig a trench, lay it in that trench and cover it up. And then it roots all along that stem. And so you get a really good root system for that plant. Next. So when it comes to Sowing Direct, those are oftentimes seeds that germinate fairly quickly. You see transplants for sale in the garden center, pumpkins, watermelons, cucumbers, squash. In my mind, all of those plants germinate fairly quickly, so they are best sowed directly in the soil. Usually it's larger seeds, vegetables, sunflowers. It's less work, You're not having to take care of little things and grow them to where you can transplant them. And you don't have to deal with acclimating the plants or transplant shock. But it's somewhat more riskier because you have to deal with weather. Maybe you plant and then you get 2 weeks of rain and it stays wet. The seed could potentially rot. Maybe you've got some voles around that like to feed on seeds that you might planted. I know one year I planted corn, and as soon as it popped out of the ground, the crows came and pulled it all up and ate the seed. I lived out in the country and the crows were there. The next year I used treated seed that had been treated with a fungicide. They didn't bother it. It was, they knew that untreated seed and they went after it. So sometimes birds can be problems too. Next. So you need to have well-prepared soil, sow in place where it's going to grow. And then this bottom slide shows you a lot of times if you've planted stuff really thick and the bottom slide is carrots, you don't want to be pulling out when you're thinning. You want to just snip those off at ground level so that you reduce the competition and they have enough space to grow. And when you do sow direct, you're going to have to keep it moist until they germinate. And it's not wet, but the soil does not need to completely dry out. Once a seed starts to germinate, if it dries out, it will die and it won't grow anymore. So keep that in mind when you're sowing direct. Next. Here's a list. I won't read this to you, but these are ones that are best planted directly. You know, I see beans sold as transplants, and it's just like you're paying more when you're buying those transplants versus you probably pay as much almost for a transplant as you would a packet of seeds. When beans, cucumber, they germinate fairly fast, usually within a week or so. So, you know, you don't really get that much ahead with transplants, and you could save money by seeding directly into the ground. Next. What are you laughing at? You fertilize based on soil test and also based on a crop. Fertilizer recommendations that come back for homeowners, you have choices like vegetables. So not necessarily tomatoes, peppers, corn, okra, different things, but it's just vegetables are all kind of grouped together. People who are growing commercially will do a different test for a specific crop. And in North Carolina and in most states, all of the fertilizer recommendations are kind of extrapolated from research that's been done on larger commercial crops. So there are certain ones when you start doing your research on them, like tomatoes, like corn, that are heavier feeders, so they need a little bit more fertilizer. So you kind of have to have that knowledge. Too much fertilizer, man, you will get some healthy, green, good-looking plants, but they may be so busy producing green growth that they don't stop to flower and produce fruit. So too much fertilizer can be just as bad as not enough. If you don't have enough, you're not going to get the growth. They may not be as productive. And soil moisture is also very important. We're not really going to talk diseases, but one I talked about to the gardeners earlier today was blossom end rot. That's, everybody thinks it's a calcium deficiency in the soil. Well, no. In North Carolina, usually we have plenty of calcium in the soil. It's related to uneven moisture levels. So feast or famine, so to speak, wet and then extremely dry. And so you get that uneven uptake of the calcium into the plant, and then you get the blossom end rot. So the trick is plant your plants, make sure they're well watered in, mulch. And the mulch helps to conserve the moisture and helps to keep the soil a little bit cooler when we get hot in summer. And if you're going to do irrigation, you can put a soaker hose or a drip line underneath that mulch so that you can keep it evenly moist is what you need to try to do. Next. So if you're irrigating or watering, the rule of thumb for all plants is basically an inch of water a week. So, yesterday or this morning or last night, I had about not even 1/10 of an inch of rain. But earlier this week, I had 1.4 inches of rain. So, I've gotten my inch of water for the week, so to speak. So you kind of have to pay attention to the weather. If you're a gardener, you probably have a rain gauge. If you get 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch in a week's time, then you're only going to need to add what you need to make up an inch. It's better to water infrequently and deeply. You don't want to go out there with a hose every day and stand there for a few minutes and sprinkle on top. If you've ever done that or you do it, then go back and look and see how far that water goes. It doesn't go very deep. So you want the water to move down into the profile, into where that root system is, And a lot of things, it may be 6 inches, but tomatoes can go a lot deeper. But you want to encourage deeper rooting so that when we do get hot and dry in the summer, they've got more roots to access water in the soil. Use soaker hoses under the mulch, or you can buy these do-it-yourself things via mail order or at the box or hardware stores with the drips, where you can put the drip right specifically at the base of your plant. If you use sprinklers, overhead sprinklers, water in the early morning. Actually, it's better if you do it right before the sun comes up, because you want that foliage to dry out quickly. You don't want it to stay wet for extended periods of time, because a lot of the fungus diseases need the water on the leaves to move in and infect the plants. Next, insect and disease control, BMP, best management practices, and that should be IPM, not IMP. Sorry, I see a typo there. IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management. So these are things that you can do to reduce the incidence of disease and insect problems. So select resistant varieties. A lot of times that is plants that are resistant to diseases. So when you go and buy tomatoes, you may see the tags that have these letters on them, like N, P, F. That means those stand for, N stands for nematodes, F is fusarium, and P is Phytophthora. The fusarium and Phytophthora are fungus diseases that these plants have been bred to be resistant to. Phytophthora is soil-borne, fusarium is spread by water and air. Use things like trap crops. Maybe an insect pest is attracted to some certain flower or another vegetable that will keep it from going to the plant you actually want to grow and harvest. And plant things that attract beneficials. If you plant flowers, you'll bring in a lot of your beneficial insects, wasps, flies, that will predate on your undesirable insect pest in the garden. Use companion planting. I haven't done a lot of that, but when I had the tomatoes and the basil, I had basil planted in amongst my tomatoes. And I don't know if it helped, but I know it brought in pollinators because of the small flowers on the basil. Use barriers. The floating row cover, you can cover up plants to protect them from insects. Just keep in mind that if it's something that has to be pollinated, you're going to have to uncover it to allow the pollinators in. One where you don't have to worry about that is cabbage or your lettuces. You can put a row cover over that because they don't have to be pollinated. But if you're growing squash, yeah, you can put a row cover over it, but you're going to have to open it up so the pollinators can get in there so you can get some fruit or vegetables. You can use soaps or oils, insecticidal soaps, neem oil, summer oil can be used. Now, any of those are considered pesticides, so you need to read the label, because some of them have temperature restrictions on them. Like, don't use this if it's going to be over 86 degrees within a certain amount of time, because what you can end up doing is it's called phytotoxicity, where you can actually damage the plant with the pesticide. And if you can, because if you're growing vegetables and fruits, these are going to be things you're going to eat. So avoid using synthetic or even organic pesticides as much as possible. I don't put anything on my vegetables or fruit that I grow in my own garden. Now, I grew up on a farm, and I used to be out there spraying with the best of them. But as I've gotten older, it's like, I don't want to have to do that. It's a pain to have to mix the stuff up and get out there and spray it. And then it's like, there's a good chance you might consume that. But if you use the pesticides according to the label direction, and it may tell you that you have to wait a day to harvest, or you may have to wait 7 days, that's why it's important that you read that label so that you know how it should be properly used. And what I do in my own garden, because I grow a lot of mostly heirloom tomatoes, and they don't have any disease resistance. So I know I'm going to have problems with the diseases every year. I rotate them as much as I can in my garden, and I just plant a few extra you know, knowing that I'm going to have these problems come in. Next. Oh, we're at the end. Questions. I hope I didn't go too fast, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I'm going to stop sharing. How about that?
Okay.
So we can get back to, well, theoretically, I'm going to stop. Oh, big sign says right there.
This was really good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Anybody have any questions? I would make the point that the tomato trench thing only works for tomatoes, right? It'd be lovely
Yes.
if it worked for other things.
It only
but
works for tomatoes, not
it
anything
only
else.
works for
Yeah.
yeah. Tomatoes are crazy plants, right? I mean, they're
Yeah.
just. I actually hacked one off one time. I mean, not on purpose, just completely broke it, stuck it back together, tied like a twist tie around it, and it lived. I
Oh,
mean,
it grafted itself back together.
yes.
You can find grafted tomatoes in
Yeah.
the trade, and we did a workshop with that. It's been a couple years ago now, and we weren't too successful with it. You have to develop your technique to really get it down to really be successful with that. But what that will give you with the grafted tomatoes is it will give you some disease resistance, you know, because you get that from the rootstock that's used.
Right. Just like grafted fruit trees and things,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So, any questions? I'll give you one more shot.
No
Well,
questions?
I have a
I'm just,
question about
Good. Go.
the tomatoes. If you buy them from the store, they're usually grafted, right?
no, you pay a lot more for grafted tomatoes than you do tomatoes that are not grafted. They're more common, but I haven't seen any, but I haven't been looking this year.
Okay.
So I don't know how common they are. A lot of the commercial growers will use them.
Because I was okay. Because I was just wondering if I keep putting I use pots for my tomatoes, and I don't want to change out the soil every year because it's a lot. And I was just wondering how bad that is if I just amend the soil and keep the same soil for the tomatoes.
There's always the possibility that if you had a disease with that last year, that your new plants this year would be infected.
Okay. If they looked okay to me, do you think would be a
Yeah, if you didn't have any disease problems last year, probably just freshen it up, you know, add a little bit to it and go from there.
okay?
Fingers crossed, candles lit.
There you go.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Debbie, this is Cindy. You know, on that slide where you said when you're thinning, it was carrots, and you said don't pull them up. Does
Yeah.
that apply to everything when you're thinning? Just
For the
snip off
most
tops?
part, because when you start pulling things out, you damage the roots of the ones that you're leaving behind. So you may set them back. You could even kill some of them, but a lot of times they'll survive, but you just set them back. So that's why it's better just to cut them off. Now, if you're growing things inside and you've planted them really thick and you're transplanting them up, you don't want to pull them up. You want to get underneath and lift them. So with a plant label, a pencil, a knife, or something like that.
A little spoon.
A little spoon, yeah.
Okay.
I
good.
use chopsticks.
Chopsticks. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Well, any more questions?
It was very
All right.
Mm,
Oh, it was a very thorough talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Well,
I
I'm
wanna go
getting the
plant
itch.
things.
I don't know about y'all, but I'm ready. I've got my garden ready for my tomatoes.
Yeah, Saturday's going to set me back a little. Last year taught me the lesson. You watch the weather.
You
Do
watch
not
the
pull
weather. You got to pay
anything out.
attention. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, guys, thank you very
All right.
much. And
Thank y'all.
don't-
See most of you soon.
yeah, exactly. We'll see you all. Bye. Thanks.
Bye. Good
Goodbye.
night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christina.
Oh, thank you, Debbie. Thank you.
Yeah. Did you go to the plant sale?
The UNCC plant sale?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I did. Yes. I only bought 8 plants because I'm
Okay,
trying
well, I
to
have my
contain
little
myself.
list, but I'm not going to get to go until Saturday.
Well, I'm not sure there'll be anything left unless they've got stuff. That place was packed.
Yeah, yeah,
It was packed.
yeah.
I took a friend of
Usually they
mine
have some more. Usually they have some
to
more somewhere
refill.
else, and so they kind of restock. Um, so I'm hoping my list is kind of short. So I'm hoping Saturday maybe I can still find a couple of what's
Oh
on
yeah,
my
I'm sure
list.
you'll find something. Did Winghaven already have their sale?
I think so.
Okay, they do by
I'm not
appointment.
sure. I'm not sure, but I think they have.
Yeah,
And
they
I've gone to
actually
that
had.
one in the past, but I usually find more things to my liking at the
Yeah.
UNCC one. And I just like to support them because I think
Oh
they
yeah.
need the support. So.
Yeah, yeah, and the gardens there are so awesome. And I've taken so many great classes there, as you know. Yeah.
Oh, I know.
I think I saw Don Bocahida there, but I wasn't entirely sure, and I don't think he was sure if it was me. So I just kept seeing this guy in a ball hat, you know. It was raining, and so we were all just trying to get our plans together. But yeah, the line to use a credit card, I would say
Uh-huh.
it was 100 people deep. I've
Oh
never
my.
seen.
So that took
So
longer than getting your plants.
well, my friend had a checkbook, so we got in line with the checks because nobody has a checkbook.
Yeah. And that was
It was
quicker, huh?
way
Awesome.
quicker, yeah. But yeah, it was
Well,
great.
it's funny. The group I spoke to earlier today, it's like they were introducing themselves to each other because a lot of them were new and they've
Mhm.
never seen each other without a mask.
Oh my goodness. Okay,
You
so
know,
my
we all
my
look
best,
different.
yeah, exactly. My best Zoom story is I was in a book club. We only met a couple of times before COVID hit, and then I said, "Oh, let's just do it on Zoom. It'll be fine."
Yeah.
So then we finally did a meeting in person, and the first thing was, "You're so tall." Well, yeah, you've only seen me on Zoom. You have no idea
You
if
only
I have
saw me on
legs.
Zoom.
Exactly. It was so funny. Wow. You know, it was,
Wow.
okay.
All right. Well, thank you for all you
Well, thank
do.
you for doing this. Oh, thanks.
Yeah,
You're
I was
welcome.
happy
Thanks.
to. Talk to you soon.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
Okay. Bye.